October 3rd, 1944, 5:47 in the morning, and Robert Hayes was standing in his grandfather's barn holding a piece of paper that was turning his entire understanding of his family upside down. The letter yellowed with age, dated April 1971, written in handwriting he didn't recognize, addressed to Thomas Hayes, Whispering Pines Farm, Route 7, Montana. And Robert had found it wedged behind a loose board in the old tack room while cleaning out the barn after his grandfather's funeral 3 weeks ago. Had almost thrown it away with the other ancient receipts and faded documents, but something made him open it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the fact that his grandfather Thomas had died at 91 without ever talking much about his past, taking most of his stories to the grave. And now Robert was reading words that made his hands shake in the cold morning air. The letter was short, only 8 lines, but those 8 lines changed everything. Mr. Hayes, you don't know me, but in June 1956, you stopped on Highway 89 and helped a black family whose car had broken down. You not only fixed our car, but you gave my father money for gas and food when every other white man had driven past us like we were invisible. You told my father that kindness doesn't have a color and that we all bleed the same. I was 7 years old, sitting in that back seat, and I never forgot your face or your words. My father died last month, and with his last breath he made me promise to find you and thank you, because that day you didn't just fix our car, you restored his faith in humanity. I don't know if you'll ever get this letter, but if you do, please know that your kindness mattered more than you could ever know. You changed how my father saw the world, and how he raised me to see it too. Thank you for being a good man when being good cost you nothing but meant everything. With eternal gratitude, James Mitchell. Robert read it 3 times. His grandfather's name at the top, this stranger's gratitude at the bottom, a moment from 1956 that his grandfather had apparently never mentioned to anyone. Just helped some people on the side of the road and moved on with his life like it was nothing, which, knowing his grandfather, it probably had been nothing to him, just something you did because it was right. And Robert felt tears burning his eyes because his grandfather had died thinking nobody really understood who he was. Died quiet and humble in a nursing home bed, never talking about his goodness, never seeking credit for a lifetime of small kindnesses that he'd scattered like seeds without ever looking back to see what grew. And Robert wished desperately that he could tell him that someone had remembered, that this James Mitchell had cared enough to write a letter even if it had gotten lost for 53 years behind a board in a barn that was probably going to be torn down next month when Robert sold the farm because he couldn't afford to keep it. The farm was 840 acres of Montana grassland that had been in the Hayes family since 1923, passed from Robert's great-grandfather to his grandfather Thomas, and supposed to pass to Robert's father David, except David had died in a car accident in 1998 when Robert was only 12, and Thomas had raised Robert himself, taught him to farm, taught him to work cattle, taught him everything except how to make farming profitable in an era of corporate agriculture and rising land prices and property taxes that increased every year while cattle prices stayed flat. And now Robert was 38 years old, divorced, childless, working a farm that lost money every year, and 3 months ago he'd finally admitted defeat and put the place up for sale, listed it with a realtor for $2.1 million, which would barely cover the mortgage and accumulated debts and leave him with maybe $200,000 to start over somewhere else, doing something else, because fourth-generation farmer wasn't a viable career anymore, no matter how much his grandfather's ghost might haunt him for giving up. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, walked out of the barn into the pre-dawn darkness, and that's when he saw the lights. Not headlights exactly, but the glow of what looked like a dozen vehicles coming up the long graveled driveway from the county road. And Robert's first thought was that someone had gotten lost, ranchers maybe, looking for a different property. But then the vehicles got closer, and he could see they weren't ranch trucks, they were semi-trucks, big commercial haulers, and they were pulling into his driveway one after another, and Robert stood there frozen, watching this impossible convoy arrive at his farm at 6 in the morning, like some kind of mechanical migration, counting them as they came. 5, 8, 12, 15, 20, and they just kept coming, pulling into his front pasture and parking in organized rows, their air brakes hissing, their engines rumbling, and Robert started walking toward them, thinking this had to be some kind of mistake, some delivery gone wrong, GPS coordinates mixed up. But then the lead driver climbed down from his cab and called out, "Robert Hayes?" And Robert said, "Yes, that's me." And the driver consulted a tablet and said, "Sir, we have a delivery for you. 100 John Deere tractors, Model 8R series. Where would you like us to unload them?" And the world stopped making sense. Robert actually laughed, a short bark of sound that came out wrong, and he said, "There's been a mistake. I didn't order any tractors. I'm selling this farm. I can't afford one tractor, let alone 100. But the driver just shook his head and said, "No mistake, sir. Order was placed 6 weeks ago. Full payment received. My paperwork says deliver to Robert Hayes, Whispering Pines Farm. This address. Signature required for receipt." And he showed Robert the tablet with an invoice that listed Robert's name and address and a delivery total of 100 units and a paid-in-full stamp and a total purchase price that made Robert's vision blur. $15.4 million. $15.4 million in tractors being delivered to a man who was 3 months behind on his property taxes and had $847 in his checking account. And Robert said, "Who paid for this? Who placed the order?" And the driver said, "Don't have that information, sir. My company was hired by a law firm in Chicago, Morrison & Chan Associates. They arranged everything, payment, delivery, the works. I just drive the truck." And Robert stood there in his work boots and flannel jacket that was 10 years old, standing in front of a convoy of semi-trucks carrying more farm equipment than he'd seen in his entire life, all of it supposedly for him, all of it paid for by someone he didn't know for reasons he couldn't understand. And he felt like he was having a stroke or a breakdown, or had somehow slipped into a parallel reality where things like this happened to people like him. The other drivers were climbing down now, 23 trucks total, each one carrying either 4 or 5 tractors loaded on double-deck trailers, and they were looking at Robert expectantly, waiting for instructions on where to unload $15 million worth of equipment. And Robert's mind was completely blank, empty, overloaded, until finally he pointed at the east pasture and said, "There, I guess, just line 'em up there." And the drivers nodded and started their coordinated unloading process, hydraulic ramps descending, massive green and yellow tractors rolling down onto Montana grass, one after another, brand new, still wrapped in protective plastic, gleaming in the growing dawn light like they'd been shipped directly from some farming heaven. And Robert pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called the only person he could think to call, his neighbor and closest friend, Martin Voss, who answered on the third ring sounding half asleep and annoyed. "Robert, it's 6 in the morning. Someone better be dead." And Robert said, voice strange even to his own ears, "Martin, I need you to come over here right now. I think I'm losing my mind." And Martin must have heard something in his tone because he said, "Be there in 5 minutes," and hung up. And Robert just stood there watching tractor after tractor roll off the trucks, watching the impossible unfold in his pasture. And he reached into his pocket and touched the letter he'd found in the barn, the letter from James Mitchell thanking his grandfather for a kindness 68 years ago. And some part of his brain that wasn't completely overwhelmed started wondering if maybe, somehow, impossibly, these two things were connected. If the past had somehow reached forward into the present and decided to pay a debt that Robert hadn't even known existed. But that was crazy. That made no sense. James Mitchell had written a letter in 1971 thanking a man for helping him in 1956. What did that have to do with Robert Hayes receiving $15 million in tractors in 2024? Except the timing was impossible to ignore. Finding the letter this morning and the tractors arriving an hour later. Coincidence didn't stretch that far. The universe didn't line up like that by accident. And Robert felt something building in his chest, some combination of awe and confusion and grief, because his grandfather wasn't here to see this, wasn't here to explain what was happening, had died 3 weeks ago, never knowing that something he'd done 68 years ago had grown into something this enormous, this impossible, this world-changing. Martin's truck came roaring up the driveway at exactly 6 o'clock, and he jumped out looking ready for an emergency, then stopped dead when he saw the semi-trucks and the growing field of tractors and Robert standing in the middle of it all looking shell-shocked. And Martin walked over slowly, looking at the tractors, then at Robert, then back at the tractors, and finally said, "What the hell am I looking at?" And Robert said, "Someone sent me 100 John Deere tractors. They just started arriving 20 minutes ago." And Martin said, "Someone sent you? Who? Why?" And Robert pulled out the letter and handed it to him and said, "I found this in Grandpa's barn this morning. I think maybe it has something to do with this, but I don't know how." And Martin read the letter while the sounds of hydraulic ramps and diesel engines filled the morning air. And when he finished, he looked at Robert and said, "The guy who wrote this, James Mitchell? You think he sent the tractors?" And Robert said, "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe his family. Or maybe I'm connecting things that aren't connected because my brain is broken from watching $15 million in equipment show up at my farm that's supposed to be sold next month." And his voice cracked on the last word. And Martin put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Robert, breathe. Just breathe. We'll figure this out." But Robert couldn't breathe properly because the lead driver was walking over with a clipboard and saying, "Sir, I need your signature confirming delivery, and there's an envelope here that came with the shipment instructions. It says to give it to you personally after all units are unloaded." And Robert took the clipboard and signed his name in a shaking scrawl that didn't look like his handwriting at all. And the driver handed him a manila envelope, unmarked except for Robert Hayes written on the front in careful block letters. And Robert held it like it might explode, knowing somehow that whatever was inside was going to explain everything or make everything more confusing, and there was no middle ground. And Martin said, "Open it." And Robert's hands were shaking so badly that Martin had to help him tear the seal, and inside was a single piece of paper, heavy stock, expensive, with a letterhead that read, "The Mitchell Foundation, Chicago, Illinois," and below that a typed letter that began, "Dear Mr. Hayes, you don't know me, but I knew your grandfather, or rather I knew of him through my father, James Mitchell Sr., who wrote him a letter in 1971 that apparently never reached him. My father passed away in 1972, just 1 year after writing that letter, from a heart attack at age 52, and with his dying words he told me and my sister about the white farmer in Montana who'd stopped to help us on Highway 89 in 1956 when our car broke down and every other driver had passed us like we were invisible. My father said that moment changed his entire understanding of what was possible between people of different races in 1956 America, said it gave him hope that kept him going through some very dark years, and he made us promise that if we ever had the means, we would find Thomas Hayes and thank him properly, repay the kindness that cost him nothing but meant everything to our family. Robert's voice caught and he had to pause, wiping his eyes before continuing. "My name is David Mitchell. I'm 75 years old now, and I've spent the last 50 years trying to honor my father's dying wish. I built a successful career in agricultural equipment sales, started with nothing and eventually owned the largest John Deere dealership network in the Midwest, retired in 2019, and sold my business for $340 million. And I've been searching for Thomas Hayes ever since, but every lead went cold. Every Thomas Hayes I found was the wrong one, and I'd almost given up. Until 6 weeks ago when my research team finally found the right farm in Montana and discovered that Thomas Hayes had recently passed away. I wept when I learned I was too late to thank him personally, but then I learned about you, his grandson, carrying on his legacy, farming the same land, and I realized that maybe I wasn't too late after all. Maybe the debt could still be paid. Maybe the circle could still close." Robert's hands were shaking so badly now that the paper rattled, and Martin took it from him gently and continued reading. "Mr. Hayes, I've done my research, and I know your farm is struggling. I know you've listed it for sale. I know you're facing the impossible economics that are killing family farms across America, and I cannot let that happen. I cannot let Thomas Hayes's legacy end because the system is broken. So I'm sending you 100 John Deere 8R tractors, top of the line, fully paid for, no strings attached. They're worth approximately $15.4 million. You can keep all of them, sell them all, or anything in between. The choice is entirely yours. But my hope is that you'll sell most of them and use the money to save your farm, pay off your debts, and give yourself the financial freedom to farm because you want to, not because you're drowning. Your grandfather gave my father hope in 1956, and that hope sustained our family through decades of struggle and eventually led to prosperity beyond anything we could have imagined. Now I want to give you the same thing, hope and the means to build something lasting on the foundation your grandfather laid. This isn't charity, Mr. Hayes. This is a debt being paid 68 years late with interest compounded by gratitude and time." The letter was signed David Mitchell, founder, the Mitchell Foundation, and below the signature was a phone number and an email address and a handwritten note that said, "Please call me. I have so much to tell you about what your grandfather's kindness grew into." and Robert stood there in his pasture surrounded by $15 million in tractors, holding a letter from a man he'd never met, learning that his grandfather's simple act of helping a stranded family in 1956 had somehow cascaded through decades and generations and ended up here, in this moment, saving a farm that was 3 weeks from being sold to developers who wanted to turn it into luxury home lots. And the weight of it was crushing and beautiful and terrifying all at once, because how do you process something like this? How do you understand that your grandfather, who died alone in a nursing home thinking he was just an old farmer nobody would remember, had actually planted seeds that grew into trees so large they cast shadows across 68 years? And Robert collapsed onto the ground, just sat down hard in the dirt and grass, and started sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere he didn't know existed. Grief for his grandfather who never knew, gratitude for this stranger David Mitchell who'd spent 50 years trying to honor his father's dying wish, relief that the farm might be saved, and overwhelming awe at the mysterious mathematics of kindness, how it compounds over time in ways you can't predict or measure or control. Martin sat down beside him, not saying anything, just being present the way good friends do, and they stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes while the truck drivers finished unloading and started pulling out, their job done, their part in this story complete. And finally, Robert pulled himself together enough to stand up and pull out his phone and dial the number on the letter, and it rang twice before a voice answered, warm and deep and heavy with emotion. "Mr. Hayes, I'd been hoping you'd call." And Robert said, his voice rough and broken, "Mr. Mitchell, I don't know what to say. I don't understand how to thank you for this." And David Mitchell's voice was thick with tears too as he said, "You don't thank me, son. I'm the one saying thank you. I'm thanking your grandfather through you. I'm closing a circle that's been open for 68 years, and I'm asking you to let me tell you the whole story, the story of what your grandfather's kindness became, because you deserve to know just how far that moment on Highway 89 traveled." David Mitchell talked for nearly an hour, sitting in his home in Chicago while Robert sat on his porch in Montana, and the story that emerged was so much bigger than Robert had imagined, so much more profound than a simple roadside assistance, and it started with the full context of what happened in June 1956 on Highway 89 in Montana when James Mitchell Sr. was driving his wife and 2 children from North Dakota to California, looking for work during the tail end of the Great Migration, when millions of Black Americans were leaving the South and rural areas for better opportunities in cities in the West. And their 1949 Chevrolet had broken down about 40 miles outside of Great Falls, engine overheating, steam pouring from under the hood, and James had pulled over and opened the hood and stood there staring at a problem he didn't have the tools or knowledge to fix, while his wife Loretta sat in the car with 7-year-old David and 5-year-old Susan, and they watched car after car slow down, see them, and speed back up, white families looking at a black family in distress and deciding it wasn't their problem, or maybe deciding it was dangerous to stop, or maybe just not seeing them at all. And after 2 hours in the Montana sun with no help coming, James was starting to think they might die there, might actually die on the side of the highway from heat and dehydration and the basic human cruelty of being invisible. And then a dusty Ford pickup truck pulled over, and a young white farmer climbed out. Couldn't have been more than 30 years old, wearing work clothes and boots, and he walked up to James and said, "Looks like you've got some trouble. Let me take a look." And James had been so conditioned to expect the worst from white strangers that he'd actually stepped back, defensive, protective. But the young farmer, Thomas Hayes, had just smiled and said, "It's okay, I'm just here to help." And he'd spent the next 45 minutes fixing the broken water pump hose with spare parts from his truck, refilling the radiator with water from his own canteen, checking the oil and the belts, and making sure everything else was sound. And when James asked how much he owed, Thomas had waved him off and said, "Nothing, just helping a neighbor." And James had said, "We're not neighbors, I don't live around here." And Thomas had looked at him with steady eyes and said, "Everyone's a neighbor when they need help. That's how my daddy raised me." And then he'd done something that James Mitchell Sr.
never forgot. He'd pulled out his wallet and handed James a $20 bill, which in 1956 was serious money, and said, "For gas and food. You've got a long way to go still. Make sure your family eats something good." And James had tried to refuse, had said he couldn't take charity, and Thomas had said something that became the foundation of how James raised his own children. He'd said, "It's not charity, it's kindness, and kindness doesn't have a color, doesn't have a price. It's just what we do when we see someone who needs help and we have the means to give it. We're all human beings, we all struggle sometimes, and the measure of a man isn't what he takes, but what he gives when giving costs him something." David Mitchell's voice was shaking as he told Robert this part, and he said, "My father talked about that moment for the rest of his life. He said it was the first time a white man had looked at him and seen a human being instead of a problem or a threat. And this was 1956, Mr. Hayes. This was 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education, 1 year after Emmett Till was murdered. This was deep in the Jim Crow era when black families traveling through places like Montana had to carry guidebooks telling them which towns were safe and which ones weren't. And your grandfather didn't just fix our car, he restored my father's faith that goodness existed, that not everyone was infected with the poison of racism, that there were still people in America who would help a stranger simply because it was right." The encounter had lasted maybe an hour total, and Thomas Hayes had driven away probably thinking nothing more about it, probably helped a dozen other people that year in similar ways, but for James Mitchell Sr., it became a defining moment, a reference point he returned to whenever he felt discouraged or angry or tempted to give up on the idea that things could get better. And he'd use the story to teach his children, David and Susan, about the kind of person they should try to be, regardless of how others treated them. He'd said, "That farmer didn't help us because we deserved it or because he'd get something back. He helped us because he saw people in need and he had the power to help. And that's the only reason you ever need to be kind to someone, just because you can be, just because it's right." And David Mitchell had carried those words with him through college at Howard University, where he'd studied business, through the early years of struggle when he'd worked as a farmhand himself, ironically enough, learning the equipment business from the ground up, through the 1970s and 80s when he'd slowly built his dealership network, one location at a time, always treating customers with the same dignity and respect that Thomas Hayes had shown his father, always remembering that you can't judge a person's worth by their appearance or their circumstances. And by the 1990s, David's business was thriving, and by the 2000s, he was one of the largest John Deere dealers in the Midwest. And by 2019, when he sold the business for $340 million, he'd employed over 800 people and helped thousands of farmers keep their operations running. And every single bit of that success, every dollar, every employee, every satisfied customer could be traced back in an unbroken line to a moment in June 1956 when Thomas Hayes had stopped his truck and helped a stranded family. "After my father died in 1972, I promised him I'd find Thomas Hayes and thank him," David said, his voice heavy with old grief. "But I was only 23 years old. I didn't have money or resources. I barely remembered what your grandfather looked like. And this was before the internet, before you could just Google someone. So I searched when I could, asked around in Montana when business took me out there, placed ads in newspapers, but I could never find him. And as the years went by and I got busier building my business, the search became less active, more of a background thing, something I'd think about but not pursue with real energy. And I felt guilty about that, felt like I was failing my father's last wish. But I told myself that maybe the debt could be paid forward instead of back. Maybe I could honor Thomas Hayes by being the kind of person he'd been, by helping others the way he'd helped us. And that's what I tried to do. David had established the Mitchell Foundation in 2015, initially focused on helping young people of color access education and career opportunities in agriculture. But in 2020, after he'd fully retired and had more time, he'd hired a professional genealogical research team to find Thomas Hayes. Gave them everything he remembered, the location on Highway 89, the approximate date in June 1956, the description of a young white farmer driving a Ford pickup, the name Thomas Hayes, which his father had remembered from reading it on the truck store, and the researchers had spent 4 years tracking down leads, finding every Thomas Hayes who'd been alive in Montana in the 1950s, eliminating false matches, following property records and census data and old newspaper archives, until finally, 6 weeks ago, they'd found Whispering Pines Farm and confirmed that Thomas Hayes had indeed owned that property from 1948 until his death in 2024. And David had immediately started making plans to come to Montana, to meet this man who'd haunted their family's story for 68 years, to finally say thank you on behalf of his father. But then he'd learned that Thomas had died just 2 weeks before the research team found him. And David said, "Robert, when I learned he'd passed, when I learned I was 2 weeks too late, I wept like I hadn't wept since my own father died. Because I'd spent 50 years trying to honor a promise and I'd failed.
I'd missed him for 14 days, and it felt like the universe was punishing me for not trying harder, for letting decades slip by. And I sat in my study and I cried and I apologized to my father's memory. And then my wife, Sarah, she came in and she said something that changed my perspective. She said, "David, you can't thank Thomas Hayes directly, but his legacy is still alive. His grandson is farming that land, carrying on what Thomas built, and maybe the debt can still be paid. Maybe you can still close the circle, just one generation removed." And that's when I started researching you, Robert, learning about your situation, and when I discovered that you were struggling to keep the farm, that you'd listed it for sale, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to give you the same thing your grandfather gave my father. I needed to give you hope and the means to keep going. Robert sat on his porch for 3 hours after hanging up with David Mitchell, just sitting, thinking, occasionally crying, while Martin stayed with him in the kind of silence that only real friendship can sustain. And the 100 tractors sat in the east pasture like a green and yellow monument to the impossible mathematics of human kindness. And Robert's mind kept cycling through the same thoughts over and over. His grandfather had helped a family in 1956 and never mentioned it, never sought credit, never told the story at family dinners or used it as a teaching moment, just helped some people who needed help and then moved on with his life like it was nothing. Which meant there were probably dozens or hundreds of other moments like that, other kindnesses scattered across 91 years of life that nobody would ever know about because Thomas Hayes wasn't the kind of man who kept score or needed recognition. He just did what seemed right and didn't look back. And Robert suddenly understood with devastating clarity that he'd never really known his grandfather, had lived with him for 26 years after his father died, had learned farming from him, had eaten dinner with him thousands of times, but never understood the depth of the man's character, had seen him as just a quiet old farmer who didn't talk much about feelings or the past, when really Thomas Hayes was someone extraordinary disguised as someone ordinary, a man who moved through the world leaving it quietly better than he'd found it, planting seeds of kindness that he'd never stay around long enough to see bloom. Martin finally broke the silence around noon, said, "Robert, what are you going to do?" And Robert looked at his friend, this man who'd been his neighbor for 15 years, who'd helped him through the divorce, who'd loaned him money when the farm was short, who'd never once made him feel small for struggling. And Robert said, "I'm going to sell 85 of these tractors and use the money to pay off every debt on this farm. I'm going to take the farm off the market. I'm going to keep 15 tractors for my own use and for loaning to neighbors who need them. And I'm going to set up some kind of fund or foundation or something to help other farmers who are drowning the way I was drowning, because that's what Grandpa would have done. That's what David Mitchell did, and that's what this whole thing is teaching me, that kindness has to keep moving, has to keep multiplying, or it dies." And Martin smiled, the first real smile either of them had managed all morning, and said, "Thomas would be proud of you." And Robert said, "I hope so. God, I hope so, because I'm terrified I'm going to mess this up. I'm terrified I'm not good enough to carry this forward." The next week was a blur of phone calls and paperwork and meetings with accountants and lawyers, and Robert contacted a John Deere dealership in Billings about purchasing 85 of the tractors, and the dealer, a man named Frank Morrison who'd been in the business for 35 years, came out personally to inspect the equipment and stood in Robert's pasture shaking his head in wonder, said, "Mr. Hayes, this is the largest private tractor collection I've ever seen. This is dealership-level inventory. Where did you get these?" And Robert told him the story, the whole story, his grandfather helping a family in 1956, the letter he'd found in the barn, David Mitchell's 50-year search, the debt being paid 68 years late. And Frank listened with increasing amazement and finally said, "Sir, I'll pay you full retail value for all 85 units. That's $13.09 million, and I'll include free delivery, and I'll spread out the purchase over 30 days so you can manage the tax implications properly. And I'm going to tell this story to every customer I have, because people need to hear it. People need to know that goodness still exists in the world." And they shook hands on it. And just like that, Robert went from being a failed farmer facing foreclosure to being a millionaire with the means to save his family's legacy and help others do the same. He paid off the farm's $680,000 in debts on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the bank manager's office, writing a check that cleared the mortgage, the equipment loans, the operating line of credit, the property taxes, everything. and the bank manager, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been the one to suggest Robert sell the farm because the numbers just didn't work anymore, looked at the check and then at Robert and said, "Mr. Hayes, I don't understand. 3 months ago you were facing foreclosure. Where did this money come from?" And Robert told her the story too, because he was starting to realize that the story needed to be told, needed to be shared, not because he wanted credit, but because David Mitchell was right. People needed to know that goodness still exists in the world. And Patricia listened and cried, actually cried in her office, and said, "My grandfather was a sharecropper in Mississippi, and when he was trying to move the family to Chicago in 1962, their car broke down in Tennessee, and a white mechanic not only fixed it for free, but gave them money for food and a place to sleep in his garage. And my grandfather talked about that man until the day he died, talked about how one stranger's kindness made him believe that America could be better than it was. And I never understood why that moment mattered so much to him until right now, until hearing your story and realizing that maybe that mechanic's kindness changed our whole family's trajectory too." Robert spent the next month in a state of emotional vertigo, trying to adjust to a reality where money was no longer the central anxiety of his existence, where he could farm because he wanted to, instead of because he was desperately trying to avoid financial collapse. And it felt strange, disorienting, almost guilty, like he didn't deserve this windfall when so many other farmers were still struggling. And he talked to David Mitchell about it during one of their increasingly frequent phone calls, said, "I feel like I won the lottery, except I didn't even buy the ticket. My grandfather bought the ticket 68 years ago, and I'm just cashing it in, and I don't know what to do with that feeling." And David, who'd become something like a mentor and friend despite the decades between them, said, "Robert, your grandfather didn't help my father expecting anything in return. He helped because he saw someone in need and he had the ability to help. That's it. That's the whole transaction. And what I'm giving you isn't payment for his kindness, because kindness can't be paid for. It's too valuable. What I'm giving you is the opportunity to multiply what he started, to take his example and scale it up, to help more people than he could have helped alone. And that's not winning a lottery. That's accepting a responsibility, a sacred trust to carry forward something beautiful that he began." And Robert understood then that the tractors weren't just a gift. They were a commission, a calling, an inheritance that came with obligations that he was only beginning to comprehend. He started researching how to structure a foundation, talking to attorneys about nonprofit status and legal implications and grant-making procedures. And the more he learned, the more complex it seemed, until one night Martin came over for dinner and found Robert buried in paperwork and legal documents and looking overwhelmed. And Martin said, "What are you doing?" And Robert said, "Trying to figure out how to set up a foundation to help struggling farmers, but it's so complicated. There's so much legal stuff and regulations, and I don't know if I'm smart enough to do this." And Martin sat down across from him and said, "Robert, stop. You're overthinking this. Your grandfather didn't need a foundation to help people. He just helped them, directly, simply, when he saw someone who needed it. So start there. Start simple. Help one farmer who's about to lose their farm the way you were about to lose yours, and then help another one, and let the structure evolve naturally, instead of trying to build some perfect system from the beginning."
The advice was exactly what Robert needed to hear, and he started asking around, quietly, carefully, trying to identify farmers in Montana who were facing financial crisis. And he found them easier than he'd expected, because the agricultural economy in 2024 was brutal, with input costs rising faster than commodity prices, with corporate consolidation squeezing family operations out of existence, with young people leaving farming because the economics were impossible. And within 2 weeks, Robert had identified 3 families who were facing foreclosure or considering selling out, and he approached each of them differently, but with the same basic offer. He'd pay off their debts, or buy them essential equipment, or cover their operating costs for a year, whatever they needed to stay viable. No strings attached, no repayment required, just help. And the first farmer he approached, a 54-year-old cattle rancher named Bill Thornton, who was 3 months from losing 400 acres that had been in his family since 1891, literally collapsed in his kitchen when Robert explained what he was offering, sat down hard in a chair and put his head in his hands and sobbed. And when he could speak again, he said, "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." And Robert said,
someone did it for me. And before that, someone did it for their family. And the only condition is that when you're able, when you're stable again, you help someone else the same way. You keep the chain going." And Bill Thornton had nodded, unable to speak, and Robert had written a check for $240,000 to clear Bill's debts. And driving home that night, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He felt purpose, felt like his life was pointing towards something meaningful, felt like he was finally understanding what his grandfather had understood all along, that the point of having resources isn't to accumulate more resources, it's to have the ability to help people when they need it most. David Mitchell flew out to Montana in early November, and Robert picked him up at the Great Falls Airport. And it was strange meeting in person after weeks of phone calls, seeing the face that went with the voice, but they recognized each other immediately. Robert in his work clothes, and David in expensive casual wear that probably cost more than Robert's entire wardrobe, but none of that mattered because they embraced in the airport like family, like men who'd been connected by threads of history and gratitude that transcended normal social boundaries. And Robert drove David out to Whispering Pines Farm, and they stood together in the east pasture where the 15 remaining tractors were parked. And David was quiet for a long time, just looking at the equipment, looking at the land, looking at the mountains in the distance. And finally he said, "I need to see where it happened, the place on Highway 89 where your grandfather stopped to help us. Do you think we can find it?" And Robert said, "We can try." So they got back in the truck and drove south on Highway 89, and David tried to remember landmarks from 68 years ago when he'd been a 7-year-old boy in the back seat of his father's overheating Chevrolet. And they drove for maybe 30 miles before David suddenly said, "Stop, here, I think it was here." And they pulled over and got out, and there was nothing special about the spot, just highway shoulder and grass and fence line, but David stood there with his eyes closed, and Robert could see him traveling back through decades, becoming that 7-year-old again, watching his father's relief and gratitude as a young white farmer fixed their car and handed them money and told them that kindness doesn't have a color. And when David opened his eyes, they were wet, and he said, "Robert, I watched my father cry that day, right here on this spot. After your grandfather drove away, my father sat on the running board of our car and cried because a stranger had been kind to him. And I didn't understand it then. I was too young, but I understand it now. I understand what it means to be seen as human when the world treats you as less than human. I understand what it means to receive grace when you've been conditioned to expect cruelty. And your grandfather gave us that, gave us a moment of pure human goodness that my father built his whole philosophy of life around." They stood on that roadside for almost an hour, two men separated by 37 years of age, but connected by a moment that had happened before either of them could have predicted its consequences. And Robert told David about his grandfather, about Thomas Hayes the man, about how he'd been quiet and humble and never talked about his goodness, about how he'd raised Robert after Robert's father died and taught him farming, but also taught him by example what it meant to be a good man, even though Robert was only now beginning to understand the depths of those lessons. And David listened and nodded and said, "My father was the same way, taught by example more than words, showed me what it meant to be dignified and kind, even when the world was undignified and cruel to you." And I think men of that generation, men like your grandfather and my father, they didn't need to talk about goodness because they lived it so completely that words would have been redundant. And Robert felt something breaking open in his chest, some understanding that he'd been searching for without knowing it. And he said, "I spent my whole life thinking my grandfather was just an ordinary man, a simple farmer, nothing special. And I'm realizing now that ordinary goodness is the most extraordinary thing in the world, that people like him, who just quietly do the right thing without seeking credit or reward, are the people who actually change everything. They're the ones who make the world work, who make it worth believing in." And David smiled through his tears and said, "Yes, exactly. They're the invisible architecture of civilization, the people who hold everything together without anyone noticing. And the tragedy is that most of them die without ever knowing the full impact of what they've done, without seeing how far their kindness traveled. Your grandfather never knew that stopping on this road in 1956 would lead to you being able to save your farm in 2024, never knew that his simple act would multiply through generations and eventually help dozens of other farmers stay on their land. But he did it anyway, without needing to know the outcome. And that's what makes it pure.
David asked to visit Thomas's grave, and Robert drove him to the small cemetery outside Carterville, where 3 generations of Hayes family were buried. The headstones simple and weathered, nothing fancy because that wasn't who they were. And Thomas Hayes's marker was the newest, still sharp-edged, the earth not yet fully settled, reading Thomas William Hayes, 1933 to 2024, farmer, father, friend. And David stood in front of it for a long time, not speaking, and then he knelt down on the cold November ground in his expensive pants, and he put his hand on the headstone and said, his voice breaking, "Mr. Hayes, I'm James Mitchell's son. You helped my family on Highway 89 in June 1956. You fixed our car and gave us money and told my father that kindness doesn't have a color, and my father never forgot you. Talked about you until the day he died, made me promise to find you and thank you. And I tried, Mr. Hayes. I tried for 50 years, but I was too late. I missed you by 2 weeks, and I'm so sorry for that. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you personally what your kindness meant, how it changed everything for us, how it became the foundation my father built his life on and I built my life on. But I want you to know that I found your grandson, and I've tried to help him the way you helped us, and I'm going to make sure that what you started on that highway 68 years ago keeps going, keeps multiplying, keeps spreading outward like ripples on water. And I hope wherever you are, you know that you mattered, that your life meant something profound, that the kindness you gave away thinking it was nothing grew into something beautiful and enormous and eternal." And he was crying openly now, this 75-year-old billionaire kneeling in the dirt, talking to a headstone, and Robert stood behind him crying too. And there was something sacred about the moment, something that transcended religion or ceremony, just 2 men acknowledging a debt that could never fully be repaid, a kindness that had compounded across decades into something that looked a lot like grace. They stayed at the cemetery for over an hour, and David told stories about his father, about James Mitchell Sr.'s life after that day in 1956, how he'd made it to California and found work in a warehouse, how he'd saved money and eventually bought a small grocery store in Los Angeles, how he'd worked 18-hour days to make it successful, how he'd put both his children through college even though he'd never gone himself, how he'd taught them that education and hard work and treating people with dignity were the keys to building a better life, and how he died too young at 52, his heart giving out from the stress and strain of building something from nothing, but how even in his final moments he'd been thinking about Thomas Hayes, asking David to find him and say thank you, making it his dying wish that the debt be acknowledged even if it couldn't be repaid. And Robert listened to all of this and felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy settling on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, an inheritance more valuable than land or money, the inheritance of character, of being the kind of person who helps strangers without expecting anything back, who plants trees knowing he'll never sit in their shade, who scatters kindness like seeds and never stays around long enough to see what grows. Over the next 3 months, Robert helped 11 more families stay on their farms, working quietly, mostly through word-of-mouth referrals from people he trusted, and each family's story was different, but the underlying crisis was always the same. Good people working hard but drowning in an economic system that favored scale over sustainability, corporate consolidation over family operations, short-term profits over long-term stewardship of the land. And Robert would show up at their kitchens or their barns and explain what he was offering: help with no strings attached, money to clear debts or buy equipment or cover operating costs until they could stabilize.
and the reactions were always the same: disbelief, followed by tears, followed by desperate gratitude, followed by the question, "Why would you do this for me?" And Robert would tell them the story: his grandfather helping a family in 1956, that family's son helping him in 2024, the chain of kindness that had to keep moving forward or it would die. And he'd say, "The only thing I ask is that when you're stable, when you're able, you help someone else the same way. You keep the chain going, because that's how this works. That's how we survive as a community, by taking care of each other." And every single family agreed, made the promise, understood that they were becoming part of something larger than themselves, part of a network of mutual aid and grace that worked outside the normal economic structures that were failing them. One of the families Robert helped was a young couple, Sarah and James Rodriguez, both 29 years old, trying to start a small organic vegetable operation on 60 acres they'd scraped together money to buy. And they were 3 months from losing everything because their well had gone dry, and drilling a new one would cost $40,000 they didn't have. And without water, they couldn't irrigate. And without irrigation, they couldn't grow vegetables. And without vegetables, they couldn't make money, and the bank was ready to foreclose. And when Robert showed up and offered to pay for the new well, plus give them $20,000 for operating capital, Sarah had looked at him like an angel or a ghost, something not quite real. And she'd said, "Mr. Hayes, we can't accept this. It's too much. We don't deserve this." And Robert had said, his voice gentle but firm, "It's not about deserving. It's about needing and me being able to help. And someday when you're successful and you see someone else struggling the way you're struggling now, you'll help them. And that's how the debt gets paid, not back to me, but forward to them." And James Rodriguez had extended his hand and said, "Sir, I promise you, if we make it, if this farm succeeds, we'll spend the rest of our lives helping other people the way you helped us." And Robert believed him because he could see the same hunger and determination in James's eyes that he'd seen in his own mirror during the darkest days before the tractors arrived.
The story started spreading beyond Montana in January 2025, when a reporter from a regional agricultural newspaper heard about what Robert was doing and asked to interview him. And Robert had been reluctant at first, didn't want the attention, didn't want to become some kind of symbol or feel like he was using other people's struggles for publicity. But David Mitchell had encouraged him, said, "Robert, the story needs to be told, not because you need recognition, but because other people need hope. They need to know that goodness still exists, that there are still people who help each other, that the system isn't completely broken. And maybe, if enough people hear the story, it'll inspire them to start their own chains of kindness, to help their neighbors, to build the kind of community networks that used to exist before everything became transactional and economic." And so Robert had agreed to the interview. And the article had run in February with the headline, "From Foreclosure to Foundation, How a 68-Year-Old Act of Kindness is Saving Montana Farms." And it included the whole story: Thomas Hayes helping the Mitchell family in 1956, David Mitchell's 50-year search, the 100 tractors arriving at dawn, Robert using the money to help other struggling farmers. And the article went viral in farming communities, got picked up by larger publications, ended up on agricultural websites and social media. And suddenly, Robert's phone was ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, farmers asking for help, people wanting to donate money to support what he was doing. And it was overwhelming and humbling and terrifying all at once. David flew out to Montana again in March to help Robert figure out how to handle the attention and the requests for help. And they sat in Robert's kitchen with Martin and a lawyer David had recommended, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who specialized in agricultural nonprofits. And they talked about formalizing the structure, creating an actual foundation with a board of directors and grant-making procedures and proper financial controls. And Patricia said, "Mr. Hayes, if you're serious about helping farmers at scale, you need organizational infrastructure. You can't just be writing checks from your personal account forever. You need a 501c3 nonprofit with proper governance and transparency and accountability." And Robert felt resistance rising in him.
It felt like all the bureaucracy and formality would somehow corrupt the purity of what his grandfather had started. But David put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Robert, your grandfather helped people directly because he was one man with limited resources, but you have the opportunity to help dozens or hundreds of families. And to do that effectively and sustainably, you need structure, you need a system. And that doesn't diminish the kindness, it multiplies it. It scales it up so the impact can match the need." And Robert understood the logic, even if it made him uncomfortable, and they spent the next week designing the Thomas Hayes Foundation, named after his grandfather, dedicated to helping family farmers facing financial crisis, with a mission statement that read, "To preserve family farming by providing emergency financial assistance to farmers in crisis," continuing the legacy of Thomas Hayes, who believed that everyone deserves a chance and that kindness is the foundation of community. The foundation launched officially in May 2025, and Robert seeded it with $5 million from the tractor sale proceeds, keeping $3 million for himself and the farm operations, which was more money than he'd ever imagined having, but felt almost small compared to the need he was seeing. And David Mitchell contributed another $10 million and agreed to serve on the board along with Martin and Patricia and 2 other farmers Robert trusted. And they established clear criteria for grants, focused on family operations with good stewardship practices who were facing temporary financial crisis. And they committed to helping at least 50 families in the first year, and the applications started flooding in almost immediately, hundreds of them, farmers from Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas and beyond, all of them telling stories of struggle and near collapse and desperate hope that someone might help them stay on land that had been in their families for generations. And reading those applications broke Robert's heart over and over, because every single one could have been his story. Every single one was a good person working hard and drowning anyway. And the foundation could only help a fraction of them, had to make impossible choices about who got assistance and who didn't. And Robert learned that being able to help some people doesn't make it easier to say no to others. It actually makes it harder, makes you feel the weight of every family you can't save.
By summer, the foundation had helped 73 families, exceeding their first-year goal, providing grants ranging from $15,000 to $200,000 depending on need, and the early results were encouraging. Most of the families were stabilizing, getting back on their feet, finding sustainable paths forward, and several had already started helping other farmers in their communities, creating local networks of mutual aid that operated independently of the foundation. And Robert could see the ripple effect spreading, could see Thomas Hayes' 1956 kindness multiplying through time and space and human connection in ways that seemed almost miraculous. And he thought about his grandfather, who'd never sought recognition, never needed to see the results of his goodness, just helped people and moved on. And Robert wished desperately that Thomas could see this, could know that his quiet life had been extraordinary, that his simple acts had changed hundreds of lives and would eventually change thousands more, that he'd planted seeds that grew into forests that provided shelter for people he'd never meet in times he'd never see. David Mitchell became a regular visitor to Whispering Pines Farm, flying out from Chicago once a month, and he and Robert developed a routine. They'd spend mornings reviewing foundation business and afternoons just working the land together. David learning to drive the tractors he'd given Robert, getting his hands dirty for the first time in decades, reconnecting with the agricultural world that had made his fortune. And in the evenings, they'd sit on Robert's porch and talk about life and legacy and the strange mathematics of grace, how kindness compounds over time in ways you can't predict or control. And one evening in late August, David said something that Robert would think about for the rest of his life. He said, "Robert, I've been successful by conventional measures. I built a business worth hundreds of millions. I employed thousands of people. I accumulated wealth that my grandchildren's grandchildren will never exhaust. But none of that matters as much as what I've been able to do with this foundation, helping farmers stay on their land, honoring my father's dying wish, closing the circle that your grandfather opened 69 years ago. And I think that's the secret that men like your grandfather understood instinctively, that the point of life isn't accumulation, it's circulation. It's keeping the good things moving, keeping kindness and help and grace flowing from person to person, generation to generation. And the tragedy of modern capitalism is that it's built on accumulation, on holding wealth, on breaking the flow.
And that's why everything feels broken, because we've stopped circulating the good stuff. We've dammed up the rivers of mutual aid and community support. And what you're doing with this foundation, what your grandfather did on Highway 89, is punching holes in those dams, getting things flowing again, reminding people that we're supposed to help each other, that that's literally the whole point of being human. In September, a woman named Catherine Morris applied to the foundation, and her story hit Robert with particular force because it mirrored his own in ways that felt almost supernatural. She was 61 years old, widowed 3 years ago when her husband died in a farm accident, trying to hold on to 520 acres in eastern Montana that had been in her late husband's family since 1897, and she was exactly 21 days from foreclosure. The bank had sent final notices, the auction date was set, and she'd applied to the foundation with the kind of desperation Robert recognized because he'd felt it himself. Had written in her application, "I know there are probably younger farmers more deserving of help, families with children who represent the future, but I'm asking anyway because this land holds 5 generations of my husband's family. Their bones are buried here, their sweat is in this soil, and I can't let it go to developers who'll divide it into ranchettes for wealthy people from California. I know I'm probably too old to save, probably should just accept defeat and move into town, but I promised my husband before he died that I'd fight for this place, and I'm fighting, even though I'm losing, even though I know it's probably hopeless." And Robert read that application sitting in his kitchen at 11 p.m., tears running down his face, because those words could have been his words 8 months ago. That desperation could have been his desperation. And he called an emergency board meeting for the next morning and told the other members, "We have to help this woman. I don't care if she's not the optimal candidate by our metrics. I don't care if she doesn't have a long-term succession plan. She needs help, and we can help, and that's enough." And the board agreed unanimously. And Robert drove out to Catherine's farm that same afternoon, found her in her barn trying to fix a broken hay baler by herself, this 61-year-old woman covered in grease and dirt and looking exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness into something spiritual. And when Robert introduced himself and explained why he was there, explained that the foundation was going to pay off her $340,000 in debts and give her $75,000 in operating capital, and she could keep her farm, Catherine had looked at him with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. And she'd said, "Is this real? Are you real? Or am I having some kind of breakdown?" And Robert had smiled through his own tears and said, "It's real. Someone helped me the same way 8 months ago, and now I'm helping you. And someday when you're stable, you'll help someone else. That's how it works. That's how we survive." And Catherine had sat down right there on the barn floor and sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that released years of accumulated fear and stress and grief. And Robert had sat with her, not saying anything, just being present the way Martin had been present for him. And after maybe 20 minutes, Catherine had looked up and said, "Your grandfather was Thomas Hayes." And Robert was surprised and said, "Yes, how did you know?" And Catherine said, "I read the article about you, about the tractors, about kindness compounding over time, and I applied to your foundation because I believed in what you were doing, but I never thought you'd actually help me. I thought I was too old, too small, too much of a lost cause." And Robert said, "Nobody's a lost cause as long as they're still fighting. My grandfather taught me that without ever saying the words, just by example, just by being someone who helped people who needed help. And you're not a lost cause, Catherine. You're a fighter, and fighters deserve support." Robert helped Catherine restructure her operation over the next 3 months, connecting her with a young farmer named Derek Chen who needed land to lease but couldn't afford to buy, and they worked out an arrangement where Derek would farm 300 of Catherine's 520 acres and pay her a percentage of the crop revenue, plus help with equipment maintenance and heavy labor, and Catherine would keep 220 acres for her small cattle operation and have the security of Derek's help plus supplemental income from the lease. And it was exactly the kind of creative solution that traditional banks and agricultural lenders never considered because they were locked into rigid thinking about how farming had to work. But Robert had learned from his own experience that survival often meant finding unconventional paths, building partnerships, creating arrangements that didn't fit standard templates but worked for the specific people and specific land involved. And watching Catherine's operations stabilize, watching the hope come back into her eyes, watching her start to believe in the future again, gave Robert a satisfaction that money could never buy. a sense of purpose that filled spaces in his soul he hadn't known were empty. The foundation's work started attracting national attention in January 2026 when NPR did a long-form story about the Thomas Hayes Foundation and the philosophy behind it, interviewing Robert and David Mitchell and several of the families they'd helped, and the piece was beautiful and thoughtful and focused on the bigger questions about community and mutual aid and whether America could rediscover the values that had sustained rural communities for generations before corporate consolidation and economic pressure destroyed the social fabric. And after the story aired, donation offers started pouring in, people from across the country wanting to contribute, retired farmers wanting to help the next generation, urban people who'd grown up on farms and felt guilty about leaving, wealthy individuals who'd made money in other industries and wanted to support agriculture. And within 6 weeks, the foundation had received over $8 million in donations, far more than Robert had ever imagined. And suddenly they weren't just helping farmers in Montana, they were expanding to Wyoming and the Dakotas and potentially beyond. And Robert felt the weight of responsibility growing, felt like he was building something that would outlive him, that would carry his grandfather's legacy forward into decades and generations he'd never see. And it was terrifying and beautiful and exactly what Thomas Hayes would have wanted, even though he'd never sought it. Sarah and James Rodriguez, the young couple Robert had helped with their well and operating capital back in November, came to visit in early December, driving up in a newer truck that was still modest but no longer held together with prayer, and they brought Robert a gift, a wooden plaque they'd made themselves with burned lettering that read, "The Rodriguez Family Farm, Est 2024, built on grace, sustained by gratitude, dedicated to paying it forward." And Sarah's eyes were shining as she explained, "Mr. Hayes, we're making it. The farm is working. We're actually making money. Not a lot, but enough. And we wanted you to know that we haven't forgotten our promise. We've already started helping other young farmers get started. We're letting 2 beginning farmers use part of our land for free to practice their growing systems, and we're teaching them everything we know. And we're planning to donate 10% of our revenue every year to your foundation so other families can get the same chance you gave us." And James added, "You changed our entire lives, gave us hope when we had none, and we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to multiply that gift, trying to create the kind of ripple effects you and your grandfather created." And Robert hugged them both, these young people who represented everything good about farming, about dedication and hard work and stewardship and community. And he thought about the chain of kindness, Thomas Hayes to James Mitchell Sr. in 1956, James Mitchell Sr. to David Mitchell through teaching and example, David Mitchell to Robert in 2024, Robert to the Rodriguez family and Catherine Morris and 71 other families, and those families to countless others they'd help in the future. And the mathematics of it were staggering, how one moment of simple human decency could multiply across 68 years into thousands of acts of grace, how goodness compounded faster than money if you gave it time and space and the right conditions to grow. The Foundation's first annual meeting in January 2026, bringing together all the families they'd helped over the past year. About 140 people gathered in a high school gymnasium in Great Falls, farmers and ranchers from across the northern plains, all of them connected by the common experience of being saved from financial collapse. And Robert stood in front of them feeling inadequate to the moment, feeling like he wasn't eloquent enough or wise enough to say what needed to be said, but he tried anyway. He told them about his grandfather, about Thomas Hayes, who'd lived 91 years and died thinking he was just an ordinary man, about the letter he'd found in the barn, about David Mitchell's 50-year search, about the 100 tractors that appeared at dawn and changed everything. And he said, "None of us asked for the crises that brought us to the edge of losing our farms. None of us deserved the suffering we endured, but suffering happened anyway. Because that's how life works. It breaks things, breaks people, breaks dreams. And the question isn't why does suffering happen? The question is what do we do when we see someone suffering and we have the power to help? My grandfather's answer was simple. You help. You don't ask if they deserve it. You don't calculate the return on investment. You don't worry about whether they'll remember or appreciate it. You just help, because you can, because they need it, because that's what humans are supposed to do for each other. And his voice broke, but he pushed through. And I'm asking all of you to carry that forward, to make the same commitment my grandfather made without knowing he was making it, to help the next person you see struggling, to keep this chain going, to prove that kindness isn't naive or weak or outdated. It's the most powerful force in the world if enough people practice it, if enough people refuse to let economic pressure destroy their capacity for grace. And when he finished, the room was silent for maybe 5 seconds. And then Catherine Morris stood up and started clapping. And then Sarah Rodriguez stood up. And then everyone was standing, all 140 people, applauding not for Robert, but for what they'd all survived together, for the network of mutual aid they were building, for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could create a different kind of economy, a different kind of community, based on circulation instead of accumulation, on grace instead of greed, on the radical idea that everyone deserves a chance, and kindness is never wasted.
David Mitchell pulled Robert aside after the meeting and said, "I have something to tell you, something I've been thinking about for months." And he looked serious, almost nervous, and Robert felt a spike of anxiety thinking maybe David was sick or the foundation was in trouble. But David said, "Robert, I'm 76 years old. I don't have children. My wife Sarah and I were never able to have kids, and I've been thinking a lot about what happens to my wealth when I die. And I've decided to leave the bulk of my estate to the Thomas Hayes Foundation. We're talking about roughly $200 million after taxes and specific bequests. And I want you to know this now while I'm still alive and can help you plan for it, because that much money is a responsibility. It's not a gift. It's a sacred trust to continue what your grandfather started and what we've been building together." And Robert felt like the ground was tilting under him. $200 million, an amount of money he couldn't even conceptualize. And he said, "David, I can't. That's too much. I'm not qualified to manage that kind of resource." But David shook his head firmly and said, "You're exactly qualified, because you understand what I learned from my father, who learned from your grandfather, that money is only valuable if it flows, if it helps, if it creates more goodness than it consumes. And I trust you to use these resources the way Thomas Hayes would have used them if he'd had them, simply, directly, without bureaucracy or ego, just helping people who need help, because that's what good people do." And Robert thought about his grandfather, about Thomas Hayes, who'd never had wealth, who'd struggled his whole life, who'd helped people anyway with the little he had. And Robert understood that David was right, that this money wasn't about Robert, wasn't about David. It was about continuing something larger than both of them, something that had started on a highway in 1956 and would continue long after they were both gone. And he said, "Okay, I'll do it. I'll be the steward of this, but only if you help me build the systems to use it wisely, to make sure it multiplies grace instead of just sitting in accounts somewhere." And David smiled and said, "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." 3 years later, in March 2029, Robert Hayes stood at his grandfather's grave again, this time with a crowd of over 200 people, farmers and ranchers from across 8 states, all of them connected by the Thomas Hayes Foundation, which had now helped 847 families stay on their land. And they'd come to dedicate a memorial, a simple stone bench beside Thomas's headstone with a bronze plaque that read, "Thomas William Hayes, 1933 to 2024. He helped a stranger in 1956 and changed the world." And Robert spoke to the assembled crowd, told the story one more time, the whole story, his voice steady now with the confidence that comes from living inside a truth for years instead of just discovering it. And he said, "My grandfather died thinking nobody would remember him, thinking he was just an old farmer who'd lived a quiet life. But he was wrong. His life echoed across 7 decades and touched thousands of people he never met. And the lesson isn't that we should all hope to be remembered. The lesson is that we should all live like my grandfather did, helping people without needing credit, planting seeds without waiting to see them grow, trusting that goodness compounds over time, even when we can't see the results."
And after the ceremony, a woman approached him, maybe 80 years old, moving slowly with a cane, and she said, "Mr. Hayes, I'm Loretta Mitchell, James Mitchell Sr.'s widow. I was in that car in 1956 when your grandfather stopped to help us. I was sitting in the passenger seat watching my husband's face when Thomas fixed our engine and gave us money. And I want you to know that moment saved more than our trip to California. It saved our marriage, saved our family, because James had been so beaten down by racism and rejection that he was losing faith in everything. And your grandfather restored that faith, reminded him that goodness existed. And that faith sustained us through 16 more years until James died, and it sustained our children after that. And now it's sustaining all these families your foundation is helping. And I needed to tell you before I die that your grandfather was one of the best men I ever met, even though I only knew him for an hour, even though he probably forgot us the next day. He was extraordinary, disguised as ordinary, and that's the most beautiful kind of person there is." Robert walked the land that evening, all 840 acres of Whispering Pines Farm, land that had almost been sold to developers, land that was now protected in perpetuity through a conservation easement the foundation had helped him establish. And he thought about the invisible architecture of grace, about how his grandfather had built something without knowing it, how one moment of simple human decency had grown into a foundation that would help farmers for generations, how kindness really did compound faster than money if you gave it time. And he understood finally what his grandfather had understood all along, without needing to articulate it, that the point of life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away, isn't what you achieve, but who you help, isn't being remembered, but being worthy of remembering. And Thomas Hayes was worthy, had been extraordinary, had changed the world one stranger at a time, one act of grace at a time, never seeking credit, never needing recognition, just doing what seemed right and trusting that right actions create right outcomes even when you can't see the results. And Robert felt his grandfather's presence in the wind moving through the grass, in the mountains watching over the valley, in the soil that had sustained 4 generations and would sustain many more. And he said out loud to the gathering darkness, "I understand now, Grandpa. I understand what you were teaching me all those years. You were showing me that ordinary goodness is the most powerful force in the world, that helping people when you can is the whole point of being human, that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems to disappear. And I promise you, I'll keep it going. I'll keep the chain moving. I'll make sure your legacy grows into something even you couldn't have imagined." And somewhere in his heart, he felt his grandfather's approval, felt Thomas Hayes's quiet satisfaction that the seeds he'd planted without knowing it had grown into forests that would shelter people for generations to come, proving once and for all that the smallest acts of human decency can change everything if you give them enough time and enough people willing to carry them forward. One stranger, one moment, one act of grace at a time.